America is becoming a very ridiculous country.
Growing up, we were instilled with a perception that China is a country of everyone is poor, half-starving, and child labor in sweatshops. And only now a lot of people are starting to see, it's like we were lied to. What was happening in China during that period as they were developing? Look at what they have developed into.
A尔丁is the chairman of the American Communist Party. He's also a well-known online commentator and the host of Infrared. He recently visited China, where we spoke with him at Renmin University about his idea of MAGA communism, American society, and how Americans view China and China-US relations. Here is a dialogue.
You have spent some days in China, and you have said China has embodied Marxism, a living example of how theory can be coexisting with the material reality. So after spending some time in China, what's your impression of China? And do you think it lived up to your expectations?
Yes, it has actually, precisely. And coming from the United States, the idea of a functioning society that has its business together, so to speak, is almost a kind of utopian thing for an American. And the notion of a society that is able to solve so many problems that we have in a way that to us appears so easy, you know, that they could just, these problems we have in the United States with endemic homelessness, antisocial phenomena, systemic dysfunction, governmental dysfunction, that these things could be addressed by a superior system, that these things could be, these kind of contradictions can be resolved. If you were to tell an American this, it's a utopia, it's a dream. But I come to China and I see Beijing and I see with my own eyes, of course China has problems, I won't deny that, every country in the world does. But they are not so endemic and just blatant and apparent. I mean, the United States, its largest cities like New York City and Los Angeles, you don't have to research the system to see the problems in the United States. You see homelessness on the street, you see violence everywhere. You see lack of sanitation, a lack of cleanliness, lack of safety. The leader of the Soviet Union, when he visited America, he visited a grocery store in the United States, this was during the Cold War, he said, if I went back home to my country and my people knew this is how Americans live, they would riot, they would be furious. And this is how I feel coming to China. You know, if Americans knew what China has accomplished and what kind of modern society it has built, they would be much more furious and angry with their own government. So anyone who's interested in Marxism in the 21st century, in some sense, has to learn from the Chinese experience, in the same way that Chinese had to learn from the Russian experience, good and bad. In America, communism in general is associated with increasingly not China and not Russia, but the Democratic Party among the right wing, you know, and this is the thing I am scared of. I'm not scared if people associate me with China or Russia or something like that, because frankly most Americans are interested and fascinated by China and Russia and other countries.
So help us understand MAGA communism. Because MAGA is a slogan that originated in right-wing US politics. How can it be reconciled with communist thought, which that movement opposed?
So MAGA is right-wing, you're right. In the beginning, MAGA was simply taking what was already there, Americanism, and putting it on a new basis, the populism. But that created a new opportunity to question many things people took for granted. This is what induced me to come up with the term MAGA communism. The MAGA movement in 2022, a rejection of NATO and the anti-Russia narrative for the Ukraine war. NATO is the aggressor. NATO is, this is incredible. NATO is fundamental to the American Cold War architecture, anti-communist Cold War architecture. If you can question NATO, if you can question the experts, if you can question the institutions and the hegemony, why not question the narratives we're told about history or the present? Why not question the ideological indoctrination people are brought up with respect to what they're told about communism and so. So to me, MAGA is just a fresh start. And actually, if you're an American, communism will be national in form regardless. So you have two options to begin. You can begin with the hegemony, politics as usual, or from this new foundation with MAGA. Either way, you're going to have to go through American constructs, so to speak, which are anti-communist intrinsically. I just thought MAGA was a better opportunity for the development and articulation of a communistic consciousness. Now, the situation today has changed. So this is why the slogan MAGA communism is not as featured prominently in my movement, because it's been rendered redundant. The whole nation has acknowledged how Trump has irreversibly changed US politics. No one now has the illusion that you can go back to politics as usual. Most MAGA people now are turning on Trump. To me, MAGA communism, in a way, was a radical overcorrection against the conventions of the US left, which aligned it with neoliberalism. And I think that it has proven correct, because the old way of politics is dead.
It requires so much explanation, but how do you approach your audience who are often conditioned by older stereotypes? Like when they mention MAGA, they will associate it with Trump naturally.
There's two reactions. That's one of them, is to simply associated with Trump. But then the other reaction is to associate it with deplorables, quote unquote deplorables. So these are rural Americans, common folk, working class Americans who live in small towns and live in the so-called flyover states. And that's the association we're tapping into. And actually, it's intentional. It was intentional from the beginning, because it's complicated to explain it. It's very abstract and theoretical. But in practice, it has allowed my movement, the movement that I'm part of, to distinguish itself from the conventional American liberal left in ways that I think has proven useful. I mean, when people look to us, they say, why are these people on the left so different from those ones? And then someone say, oh, well, those are the MAGA communists. MAGA communists are different. And we like this because the conventional US liberal left, under the Biden administration, reached the pinnacle, in our view, of insanity. Absolute derangement and lack of any kind of sensibility that is rooted in not just the masses, but also reality at large. You had this, maybe I sound silly. I learned there's a term that was invented in China, coined in China, called baizuo. That's what it is. It's baizuo, it's kind of sanctimonious, extremely moralistic, laser focused on identity politics. And people don't believe it when I tell them. When I tell friends in Russia or China or elsewhere, I tell them this is the US left. If you are a white man who is straight and cisgender and maybe you're not obese and you're healthy or something, you are an oppressor. The only revolutionary subject is the most marginal, imaginable kind of person. That is not a popular subject. That's not the masses, you see. I feel it's very tragic because myself, my comrades, my movement, this was before the party was reconstituted. We tried so hard to fix the US left, and it was too late, sadly. The American left is being destroyed.
You mentioned American people are interested in China, but from what we saw in the Western mainstream media, China is much like being demonized. So how do you tell the story about real China to your audience?
Do you trust the media? The minute you say, well, the reason they're trying to demonize China is because China poses a threat to those who rule us, to our elites, to the Epstein network. China is not controlled by Epstein. It's not controlled by Wall Street. It's not controlled by the corrupt American ruling class. Of course, American ruling class is motivated by greed. It's motivated by self-interest, private interest, corruption. And how do American people know this? Because they are experiencing it domestically. Why do we not have health care? Why is the rent going up so much? Why is life becoming unaffordable? Why are people sinking deeper and deeper into debt and into poverty? Well, because we don't have a government that serves our interests, but which serves the interests of a small private cabal.
How do you see China's approach towards other countries, like China's Belt and Road Initiative differ from Americans' interventionist approach?
That's one of the more difficult things. As somebody who has debated about China with many Americans and engaged in many political debates, most people are too cynical to comprehend the possibility of a foreign policy that is not based on a game theoretical model of a zero-sum game. So for most Americans, they still have a kind of Darwinistic attitude where it's survival of the fittest and one person's victory must come at the expense of someone else's loss. You cannot win without making someone else lose. You cannot be happy without making someone else suffer. If you want to know the truth about American foreign policy, look at how they lie about China, because it's projection. When they say that China is pursuing hegemony and China is trying to control the world, and this is how they see the world. Because the facts show China is not doing this. China has never interfered in the sovereignty of another country. Its dealings in Africa and the rest of the world have absolutely nothing to do with regime change, with cultural change, with civilizational change. China is interested in economic agreements, right? The Belt and Road Initiative takes into account the factors that are responsible. For example, why can't countries pay back their debts? Why can't countries negotiate trade on an equal basis? Well, because they're underdeveloped. So the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative is based on accelerating and spreading global development of the productive forces. And this is beneficial for China, yes, but it's also beneficial for those outside of China. And that is something that the cynical American mind finds very hard to accept. There must be some kind of trick. There must be some kind of way in which one person's interests are being asserted adversarially against those of another.
Do you think this kind of skepticism could be reduced after they travel to China and see China?
Yes, I think so. But there is such a strong barrier to which is related to education. Most Americans are not educated in matters of history and form. You know what they are educated, though, is a kind of common sense. In a country where it's every man for himself, dog eat dog, it's very compelling to accept narratives that treat everything as a zero-sum game. And the possibility of win-win cooperation sounds like a utopian dream. But you think about it, and Americans don't have health care, they don't have housing, they don't have free, affordable education or good job opportunities, and it's precisely related to this kind of cynicism we have, as Americans. And how could this be reversed? How could it be challenged? Well, I think firstly, America's own contradictions need to be confronted by Americans. If they can do that, then this will open up the possibility for all manner of newfound perspectives about foreign policy. The thing I would like to strongly emphasize here, it became so easy for Americans to reject the Cold War-based narratives against Russia when the Ukraine war happened. It's not because Americans suddenly got a college education and history of geopolitics, but because their antagonism and skepticism toward the system led them to a point where they found counter-hegemonic narratives more compelling because they related it to their own contradiction against the hegemony and the system. So the more this contradiction develops and is articulated within the domestic context, the more Americans will be able to have a friendlier attitude toward so-called U.S. foreign adversaries. So-called, right? Americans will sympathize with China more the more they resent and dislike their own government. They will do that by themselves. China doesn't even need to do anything to compel them and persuade them. Growing up, we were instilled with a perception that China is a country of everyone is poor, half-starving, and child labor in sweatshops. So we were told China's working conditions are so bad, they're slaves. That's just how we were raised. And only now a lot of people are starting to see, not because the media's narrative is changing, not because the school's narrative is changing, But because people are posting and uploading videos from China's cities, they're seeing it on YouTube, on TikTok, on social media, they're saying we were lied to. What was happening in China during that period as they were developing? Look at what they have developed into. We weren't told that this was what they were working toward. We weren't told that this is what China is and this is what, China looks like. And you know the American YouTuber I Show Speed? Yeah, he came to China and he live streamed different parts of China, and that opened a lot of people's eyes. They didn't know this was the real China. They thought China was what they were taught in middle school. It's fascinating because the Cold War narratives America used to deploy against communist countries, it's actually true for... We have an iron curtain around our country in America. And thanks to social media and the internet, we have broken out of it, but this has been at the expense of what our regime wants us to think.
How do you envision the future in terms of China-US relations and in terms of domestic US politics?
I think that the contradictions that are at the heart of the polarization driving domestic US politics, which goes beyond mere polarization of consciousness, but reflects a systemic dysfunction and a real crisis of constitutional legitimation. I say this, I've been saying this consistently, I think it's pointing in a direction of the breakdown of the constitutional order, and the United States as we know it, as a state, will not exist. If something like that can happen without a civil war, I would be surprised. But because there are only two ways a country's regime can be reconstituted. One is a revolutionary change. I don't see that happening soon in America. And the second thing is a war. Maybe an external war, a war against Russia or aggression against China. US-China relations should be looked at under that lens, because the American regime needs legitimation among the population it doesn't have right now. It doesn't have the necessary support to go to war with China. Or any other country for that matter. Trump experimented with going to war with Iran just recently. The backlash among his own supporters against that was so severe, he had to pull back and question himself on that. So I think US-China relations will continue to deteriorate as an attribute of a more general and overall systemic dysfunction. I'm very pessimistic, frankly, because if you look at Trump's rhetoric regarding trade wars, if you're looking at his rhetoric in terms of how he speaks about China's actions, China is, engaging in illegitimate behavior. It seems like the American ruling class is trying to rhetorically build the foundation for a narrative to engage in a political aggression.
So when American politicians talk about military intervention or actual wars, the rest of the world shouldn't be too worried, but they still have the power to sanction, tariff the world, and bring different chaos to the world.
Yes, they will try to do everything within their power. They've exhausted every trick in the book. They tried the color revolution method. Now that was working very well until actually it failed in China. I remember in 2016 when Trump was elected, this actually, I've been told this many times, that there are many Chinese patriots who were very happy about Trump coming to power because it fueled sentiment of national rejuvenation within China. And I think that trade wars and tariffs and so on will probably have a similar effect on China and on other countries. It will undermine the kind of unipolar global architecture, and it will encourage more sovereign kind of orientation. A new global framework is probably necessary, and protectionism and going inward is not the exclusive solution. But there must be a new kind of global order that is rooted in respect for the self-determinations of nations on an equal basis. That's not possible in the US-led framework.
So the new world order will be much like a China or BRICS or Global South-led version?
I would emphasize China-led probably, in my personal opinion. I think only China has the right and the ability. Other countries are institutionally compromised, and they don't have economic systems, and they don't have political logic that's governing them, that's capable of challenging. Common sentiment is Americans fed us a bunch of lies about how to run a country. Actually, the Chinese know how to run a country. China knows how to build things, and they run, and look at China, it's so much better how they do things. And the global south is now polarized between America versus China. And China is winning people's favor and morale. But really, China is the only state, modern state, I would say, that is governed by principles that are not fundamentally, and when all is said and done, controlled by the private interest. And that should not be taken for granted. There's no way there's going to be a new world order unless there is an ability to muster the courage and resolve to stand up to U.S. imperialism.
Just a personal question. Is it easy to find a job in the United States right now for young people?
No.
Not easy?
Even if you're educated, no. It's maybe easy to find, even then it's not easy, but physical work. So
Part-time.
most lucrative probably is blue collar. Service is easy. You can get a job in the service sector. You can't live off of that though. You can't live working at McDonald's. You can't pay your rent and survive off of that. There's no way. And many Americans won't leave their home. They can't afford a home. They can't even afford an apartment.